If Kowloon-walled city was an entire planet, that's Coruscant. And here's why everyone inside should already be dead. Before we prosecute the impossible city, we need to visit the nightmare that actually existed. A place so dense, so structurally deranged, so utterly hostile to human habitation that it serves as the only real-world comparison point for what George Lucas dreamed onto the screen without ever consulting an engineer. The Kowloon-walled city stood in Hong Kong from 1947 until its demolition in 1993. During its peak years, it achieved something unprecedented in human history: a population density of at least 3.2 million people per square mile across approximately 14 stories of unregulated vertical construction. To put that number in perspective, Manhattan's densest neighborhoods manage roughly 70,000 people per square mile. Kowloon was 45 times denser, 45 times more human beings crammed into the same footprint, stacked atop one another in a labyrinth of unlicensed construction, illegal utilities, and architectural anarchy. The lower levels existed in perpetual twilight. Alleyways measured 1 to 2 meters wide. Sunlight didn't reach the ground floors. Residents lived beneath corrugated metal, dripping pipes, and the undersides of structures built by strangers above them. Disease flourished. Structural integrity was a polite fiction. Electrical fires were endemic because wiring had been improvised by residents who tapped illegally into Hong Kong's power grid, creating a rat's nest of cables that no inspector ever approved, because no inspector ever entered. The building was demolished, not because it was a moral outrage, though it was, because engineers concluded it was a structural collapse waiting to happen. 14 stories of improvised construction, stacked without adequate foundations, without ventilation, without light, without the basic prerequisites of human habitation. Now imagine that nightmare scaled to a planet. Not 14 stories, 5,127 vertically stacked levels. Not a few city blocks in Hong Kong. The entire surface of a terrestrial world. Not a single building's desperate population. Over 1 trillion sentient beings. If the Kowloon-walled city was the architectural equivalent of a scream, a desperate, improvised howl against poverty and overcrowding, then Coruscant is that scream sustained for 100,000 years and amplified until it encompasses a planet. The Kowloon-walled city was demolished because 14 stories of unplanned construction threatened to collapse. Coruscant has been building upward for approximately 100,000 years. By 5,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, it had almost entirely covered its planetary surface with urban development. The question we're here to answer is brutally simple. How is the bottom level not collapsing? The answer, when we run the numbers, is equally simple. It should be. Every calculation we perform will arrive at the same conclusion. The structural load physics don't work. The atmospheric pressure differentials don't work. The thermodynamics absolutely don't work. George Lucas, in his infinite visual genius, created one of the most iconic settings in science fiction history, and he did so without ever asking a structural engineer whether the bottom of his city could support the top. This isn't an attack on Lucas. This is the disappointed observation of an engineering analysis conducted posthumously on a building that was never submitted for review. The blueprints are beautiful. The blueprints are impossible. And we're about to prove why everyone in the lower levels of Coruscant should already be dead. The mathematics begins simply enough. Coruscant's planetary cityscape consists of 5,127 vertically stacked levels. This is canon. This is the number. Now we must assign that number a physical reality, because in the films, the levels scroll past in beautiful establishing shots without anyone mentioning how tall they actually are. The Star Wars visual dictionaries and technical references assume floor heights comparable to modern skyscrapers, 3 meters per level for standard construction, with some levels being considerably taller for industrial or governmental purposes. Let's be generous. Use 3 meters. 5,127 levels multiplied by 3 meters per level equals 15,381 meters. That's 15.4 kilometers of vertical construction. That's higher than the tropopause. The tropopause is the atmospheric boundary where clouds stop forming and the stratosphere begins. It sits at an average altitude of 10 to 13 kilometers in temperate latitudes. When you stand at the top of Coruscant's canonical 5,127 levels, you're standing in the stratosphere. You're above the point where weather happens. You're in the realm where commercial aircraft cruise. And if you were standing there without a pressurized suit and supplementary oxygen, you'd be in severe distress within minutes. Atmospheric pressure halves approximately every 5.5 kilometers of altitude gain. The human death zone begins above 8,000 meters, where atmospheric pressure drops below 356 millibars, and oxygen partial pressure is insufficient to sustain human life without supplementary oxygen. At 15 kilometers, the pressure is approximately 120 millibars, roughly 1/8 of sea level pressure. The tallest skyscrapers on Coruscant would require complete pressurization, continuous oxygen supplementation, and the kind of environmental containment we currently use for space stations. The penthouse suites of the Senate District aren't just expensive real estate. They're effectively spacecraft cabins. But here's the thing. The upper levels are, in some ways, the easy problem. Wealthy beings live up there. They have resources. They can pressurize their luxury apartments. Senator Palpatine's office probably has life support systems that would make NASA jealous. The horror begins when you look down instead of up. If Coruscant's upper levels exist in near-vacuum conditions, then Coruscant's lower levels exist under crushing atmospheric pressure that canonical sources never address. Consider, the original surface of Coruscant, Level 1, if such a thing can still be said to exist, sits beneath 15 kilometers of enclosed city structure. What happens to atmospheric pressure in those conditions? Descending just 5,000 meters into deep underground structures increases ambient barometric pressure by 66%, creating massive compressive stress on lower levels and altering the toxicity of airborne pollutants. Coruscant's lower levels are 3 times that depth. The pressure differential would be catastrophic for organic life, even before we consider what that pressure is being exerted upon. The residents of level 1000 wouldn't just be living in darkness and squalor. They'd be experiencing atmospheric conditions equivalent to diving to 30 meters underwater, continuously, for their entire lives. At elevated pressures, even normal atmospheric gases become toxic. Oxygen toxicity begins to occur at partial pressures above 1.6 atmospheres. Prolonged exposure causes seizures, vision changes, and eventually death. Nitrogen narcosis begins to impair cognitive function at depths corresponding to roughly 2 to 3 atmospheres. The residents of Coruscant's lower levels, if they're breathing a standard oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere at the pressure their depth implies, would be experiencing chronic hyperbaric illness, confusion, impaired judgment, increased susceptibility to oxygen toxicity. The canonical depiction of the lower levels as lawless and desperate takes on a grimmer cast when you realize everyone down there should also be chronically impaired by the atmospheric conditions. Traveling upward would require decompression stops to avoid the bends. Think about that for a moment. In any realistic engineering scenario, a resident of level 1313, the notorious underworld district we see in the Clone Wars, couldn't simply take a turbo lift to the Senate District. They'd need hours of gradual pressure equalization at intermediate levels, or they'd suffer decompression sickness. Their blood would literally fizz with nitrogen bubbles. They'd experience joint pain, neurological damage, potentially death. The class stratification of Coruscant isn't just economic, it's physiological. The people at the bottom couldn't survive at the top, even if they could afford the ticket. But even if we hand-wave the pressure with some unspecified Star Wars technology, perhaps there are magical atmospheric processors at each level, maintaining sea level pressure throughout the entire city planet. We still can't escape the thermodynamics. And the thermodynamics are where Coruscant becomes not just impossible, but horrifying. The human body produces 80 to 100 watts of heat continuously at rest. That's equivalent to a 100-watt incandescent light bulb running constantly. You're a heat source. You're always radiating. Even when you're sleeping, you're warming your environment. Now multiply that by Coruscant's canonical population, over 1 trillion residents, 1 trillion beings generating 100 watts each. That produces 100 terawatts of continuous biological waste heat, before accounting for any machinery, starships, or infrastructure. To put 100 terawatts in perspective, the total power consumption of human civilization on Earth is approximately 18 terawatts. Coruscant's living beings alone, standing perfectly still, doing nothing, generate more than 5 times the total energy output of modern Earth. Every hour, forever. Where does that heat go? In any normal city, waste heat rises and dissipates into the atmosphere. The urban heat island effect, the phenomenon that makes cities several degrees warmer than surrounding countryside, occurs because paved surfaces absorb and radiate heat while buildings reduce airflow. Paved surfaces reach up to 50 degrees Celsius on sunny days. Even so, heat eventually escapes upward into the sky. It radiates away at night. It convects upward during the day. Coruscant's lower levels have no sky. They have only the undersides of the levels above them, which are themselves generating heat. There is no night. There is no escape. The heat accumulates. Deep enclosed environments inherently struggle with heat dissipation because waste heat accumulates without natural convection to carry it to the surface, requiring massive active cooling systems. This is why server farms require massive cooling infrastructure, often more cooling capacity than computing power, to prevent equipment from melting. This is why underground facilities require constant ventilation. This is why the London Underground, despite being only a few tens of meters below street level, reaches dangerously high temperatures during summer heat waves. The Moscow Metro has recorded temperatures exceeding 40 degrees Celsius during heat waves. And that's with regular ventilation and access to the surface atmosphere. Now imagine 3,000 levels between you and fresh air. Each level above you is generating heat. Each level above you is blocking your heat from escaping. The cumulative effect would be an exponential temperature increase as you descend. The numbers suggest temperatures well in excess of human survival thresholds. Not uncomfortably warm, literally unsurvivable. The lower levels of Coruscant would be an oven. The residents of level 1000 would be baked alive by the metabolic output of the 5,000 levels above them. The criminals and outcasts we see skulking through the underworld in the Clone Wars shouldn't be worried about blaster fights and gang warfare. They should be worried about heat stroke, about cooking in their own skin. The only way to prevent this would be planetary-scale refrigeration, cooling systems capable of extracting 100 terawatts of heat and radiating it into space. Such systems would be the most prominent feature of Coruscant's infrastructure, dominating the skyline with massive heat exchangers and orbital radiator arrays. They're never mentioned in any canon source. They're never depicted in any film or series. Either they exist invisibly, the greatest engineering achievement in galactic history, operating silently and without maintenance requirements, or everyone below level 3000 was cooked to death millennia ago, and the upper levels simply haven't noticed. Given what we know about the Galactic Senate's attentiveness to the suffering of lower-class populations, that second option doesn't seem as unlikely as it should. Now we arrive at the core structural problem, the one that keeps structural engineers awake at night when they accidentally think about Coruscant. The question that forms the title of this entire examination: how is the bottom level not collapsing? Heavy-duty industrial concrete, the strongest we can reliably produce, rated at 5,000 pounds per square inch or greater, supports a maximum load capacity of approximately 4,000 to 6,000 pounds per square foot. That's the ceiling. That's the absolute maximum a reinforced concrete structure can bear before catastrophic failure. Now let's perform the calculation that no one at Lucasfilm ever commissioned. Assume each level has an average thickness of 3 meters. Generous for residential and commercial space, conservative for industrial levels. Assume standard reinforced Duracrete construction comparable to heavy-duty concrete. Assume an average floor loading of 150 pounds per square foot, when considering structural materials, basic utilities, and minimal furnishings. The cumulative load on level 1 would be 5,127 levels multiplied by 150 pounds per square foot. That yields 769,050 pounds per square foot. We're asking the foundation to support more than 128 times the limit of our strongest industrial concrete. The structural failure wouldn't be gradual. It would be instantaneous and catastrophic. The bottom wouldn't slowly sink. It would pancake. The entire city planet would compress like an accordion, level after level, slamming into the one below as the structural supports failed, in a cascade that would take perhaps 30 seconds to reduce Coruscant from an ecumenopolis to a planetary rubble field. The square cube law magnifies this problem beyond rescue. When an object is scaled up, its volume and weight increase by the cube of the multiplier, while surface area only increases by the square. This is why insects can lift many times their body weight, while elephants can't. It's also the reason why a building 5,000 levels tall cannot exist in any universe that respects physics. When we scale up a structure, we must increase the cross-sectional area of its supports proportionally to the increase in load. But the load increases as the cube of the scaling factor, while structural strength increases only as the square. A building twice as tall requires supports more than twice as thick. A building 5,000 times as tall as a single-story structure requires supports so massive that the building would consist almost entirely of structural material, with no room left for occupants. The base of the structure would need to be solid material all the way up. What would Duracrete need to be to make Coruscant possible? Working backward from the required compressive strength, Duracrete would need to exceed 500,000 pounds per square inch, approximately the strength of industrial diamond, to support the dead load of the levels above. No construction material in real engineering achieves such properties while remaining practical for building construction. The only way Coruscant works is if Duracrete is a fundamentally impossible material that combines the strength of diamond with the workability of concrete and the cost-effectiveness of asphalt. The Star Wars technical commentaries, bless their hearts, never address this. The Wikipedia entry for Duracrete mentions its durability and widespread use throughout the galaxy. It doesn't mention the specific tensile and compressive strength required to support a planetary structure 5,000 levels deep. Because if they did mention it, they'd have to admit the number is physically impossible. We've established that the structure should collapse, the atmosphere should be unbreathable at both extremes, and the heat should cook everyone alive. But we haven't yet addressed the timeline. And the timeline is where Coruscant goes from merely impossible to actively paradoxical. Coruscant began its vertical urbanization approximately 100,000 years before the Battle of Yavin. 100 millennia of continuous construction, level upon level upon level, rising from the original planetary surface toward the stratosphere. By 5,000 years before Yavin, the planet had almost entirely covered its surface with urban development. This is canonical. This is the officially established timeline. Coruscant is ancient beyond human comprehension, a world that has been building upward for longer than our species has existed. And yet, and here is where the structural engineers and the lore scholars finally agree on something, the Jedi Temple sits at the top. The modern Coruscant Jedi Temple was constructed approximately 1,000 years before the events of A New Hope. 1,000 years ago, the Jedi built their temple. And they built it at what is now level 5,127, the surface level, the uppermost stratum of the planet city. Do you see the problem? If Coruscant has been building upward for 100 millennia, and the temple was built 1,000 years ago, then by every sensible construction logic, the temple should be approximately 1,000 levels below the current surface, buried beneath a millennium of subsequent construction. Instead, it sits proudly at the top, surrounded by the skyline we see in the prequel trilogy, accessible via approach vectors that only make sense if it's at the highest point of the city. The implications are either absurd or revelatory. Option 1. Coruscant completed its vertical expansion approximately 1,000 years ago and has simply stopped building upward since then. This contradicts everything we know about the planet's explosive population growth and endless urban sprawl. 1 trillion beings live on Coruscant. Are we to believe they've spent the last millennium building only horizontally, somehow finding lateral space on a planet already completely covered in city? Where would they put it? On top of what? Option 2. The Jedi Temple has been repeatedly demolished and rebuilt higher as the city rose around it. This would require the Jedi Order to be surprisingly willing to destroy their own ancient architecture every few centuries, reconstructing their sacred halls at whatever elevation the surrounding construction had reached. No canonical source supports this. The temple is repeatedly referred to as ancient, as a fixed point in Coruscant's history, not as a structure on its 5th or 6th rebuild. Option 3, and this is the explanation that lore scholars have quietly settled on without ever admitting how strange it is. The upper levels were built around the temple while carefully avoiding it, treating it as a fixed point that the city flowed around like water around a stone. This is architecturally lunatic. This is the equivalent of building a city skyline that respectfully avoids a single cottage in the center because no one wants to ask the residents to relocate. For 1,000 years. Across an entire planetary urban sprawl. But it's also the only explanation that fits the visual evidence. The Sith shrine beneath the temple deepens the paradox into something approaching cosmic irony. The Jedi Grand Temple was erected directly over the ruined foundations of an ancient Sith shrine, constructed approximately 5,000 years before the events of Revenge of the Sith, in a symbolic attempt to bury and neutralize its dark side energy. The Jedi built their temple on top of a Sith shrine. The shrine was ancient even by the standards of a civilization that measures time in millennia. 4,000 years old when the Jedi began construction. The dark side nexus had been festering in that location for 4 millennia before anyone thought to build a Jedi academy on top of it. And both structures, the temple and the shrine beneath it, sit at what is canonically the surface level of a city that has been building upward for 100,000 years. The Sith shrine should be buried beneath 95 millennia of construction. The Jedi Temple should be buried beneath 1,000 years of construction. Neither is. Both sit at the top of the city, as if Coruscant somehow built around them. Not just the temple, but the ancient Sith ruin beneath it. As if the entire architectural history of the planet conspired to keep this one location at the surface while burying everything else. The dark side works in mysterious ways. Apparently, one of those ways is zoning regulations. Let's pause and consider what we've established. The bottom should collapse. The math doesn't work. 769,050 pounds per square foot exceeds the load-bearing capacity of any known material by a factor of 128. The square cube law makes the structural requirements exponentially worse as height increases. Duracrete would need to be stronger than diamond to function as advertised. The atmosphere should be unbreathable. At the top, you're above the tropopause, in near-vacuum conditions. At the bottom, you're under crushing pressure that would cause nitrogen narcosis, oxygen toxicity, and chronic decompression illness. Traveling between levels would require hours of pressure equalization. The heat should cook everyone alive. 100 terawatts of biological waste heat with no mechanism for dissipation. The lower levels would reach lethal temperatures within decades of initial occupation. The timeline makes no sense. Ancient structures sit at the surface of a city that's been building upward for 100,000 years. The Jedi Temple and the Sith Shrine beneath it should both be kilometers underground. And none of this accounts for water supply, waste disposal, food production, or any of the other logistical nightmares that would face a planetary population of 1 trillion beings. Where does the food come from? Coruscant has no agriculture. The entire planetary surface is covered in city. The answer, canonically, is that food is imported from agricultural worlds. But think about the tonnage required to feed 1 trillion beings. Think about the number of cargo ships. Think about the distribution networks required to move that food from starports to individual residential units across 5,127 levels of city. Where does the water come from? Where does it go after use? Coruscant supposedly has weather control systems that regulate the planet's climate, but these systems would need to manage the water cycle for an entire ecumenopolis. Every drop of water on the planet would need to be recycled, purified, and redistributed. The infrastructure for this would dwarf the city itself. Where does the waste go? 1 trillion beings produce billions of tons of biological waste annually. Processed how? Transported where? The canonical answer involves orbital processing facilities, but the logistics of moving that much material from planetary surface to orbit, continuously, forever, without ever falling behind, defies comprehension. Coruscant doesn't have an infrastructure problem. Coruscant is the infrastructure problem. The entire planet is a Rube Goldberg machine of impossible logistics, held together by nothing but narrative convenience and the audience's willingness to not ask too many questions. Here's where I'm supposed to reveal the solution, the clever engineering workaround that Lucasfilm secretly calculated, the hand wave that makes everything work. There isn't one. I've looked. The Star Wars technical manuals don't address it. The novelizations don't address it. The visual dictionaries mention that the lower levels are dangerous and poorly lit, but they don't explain how anyone down there is still breathing, still surviving the heat, still standing on structures that should have collapsed millennia ago. The closest thing to an explanation is Duracrete itself, the fictional material that all Coruscant construction supposedly uses. But even if we grant Duracrete impossible material properties, strength exceeding diamond, thermal conductivity defying physics, structural behavior that ignores the square-cube law, we still can't explain the atmosphere or the heat. Duracrete can't make air breathable at extreme pressures. Duracrete can't extract waste heat from enclosed environments. Duracrete can't solve the timeline paradox of ancient temples sitting at the modern surface. The truth is that George Lucas wasn't trying to pass an engineering review. He was creating an image, a visual, a sense of scale and wonder that would make audiences feel the weight of galactic civilization. And he succeeded. The establishing shots of Coruscant in the prequel trilogy remain some of the most breathtaking cityscape visualizations in cinema history. The endless towers, the streams of traffic, the impossible verticality. When we first see the Senate building rising from the urban expanse, we feel the grandeur of the Republic. When we descend into the lower levels in the Clone Wars, we feel the decay and desperation of those forgotten by the upper world. Lucas wasn't building a city. He was building a feeling. The problem is that some of us, the engineers, the physicists, the obsessive fans who run the numbers at 2 a.m, can't stop thinking about the feeling and start thinking about the foundations. We look at the beautiful, impossible city and we ask, but how does it work? And the answer is, it doesn't. It doesn't work. It can't work. The physics don't permit it. The engineering doesn't allow it. The logistics defy comprehension. Coruscant is a lie. A beautiful, magnificent, civilization-defining lie that has anchored Star Wars storytelling for decades. But here's the thing. That's not a criticism. That's the point. Science fiction has always operated on the principle of selective impossibility. We accept faster-than-light travel because the story requires it. We accept artificial gravity because filming in zero-G is expensive. We accept sound in space because silence would be narratively unbearable. Coruscant is just another impossibility in a universe built on them. The difference is that most Star Wars impossibilities are physics impossibilities, things that violate our understanding of how the universe works, but which might conceivably be explained by technologies we don't yet understand. Hyperspace might be possible with the right exotic matter. Lightsabers might be possible with the right plasma containment. The Force might be possible if midichlorians turn out to be real. They don't. Please don't be real. Coruscant isn't a physics impossibility. It's an engineering impossibility. It's not that we don't know how to build it. It's that we know, with mathematical certainty, that it cannot be built. Not with any material. Not with any technology. Not in any universe that respects basic structural principles. And somehow that makes it more charming, not less. Because Coruscant isn't trying to be realistic. Coruscant is trying to be mythic. It's the city that has always existed and will always exist, the eternal center of galactic civilization, the place where the Republic rose and fell and rose again. It's not meant to be calculated, it's meant to be felt. The absurdity is the charm. When we see the endless towers of Coruscant, we're not supposed to think about load-bearing calculations. We're supposed to feel small. We're supposed to feel the weight of history pressing down on the characters, just as 5,127 levels of city would press down on anyone foolish enough to live at the bottom. The metaphor is the point. Coruscant is a visual representation of a civilization that has grown so vast, so complex, so stratified, that it has lost touch with its own foundations. The people at the top literally cannot see the people at the bottom. The surface is separated from the depths by 15 kilometers of vertical construction and 100,000 years of accumulated history. The Sith shrine beneath the Jedi Temple isn't just a lore detail, it's a metaphor. The Jedi built their sacred space on top of darkness they thought they had buried, without realizing that darkness doesn't stay buried. It seeps up through the foundations. It corrupts from below. Just as Palpatine corrupted the Republic from within, the dark side corrupted the Jedi Order from beneath their very feet. Coruscant's impossible engineering is a feature, not a bug. Let's return, one last time, to the Kowloon walled city. When researchers documented the structure before its demolition, they found something unexpected. Despite the chaos, despite the lack of planning, despite the 14 stories of improvised construction and illegal utilities and structural nightmares, people had built a community. The walled city had schools, clinics, places of worship, businesses. Families raised children there. Neighbors looked out for each other. In the perpetual twilight of the lower floors, where sunlight never reached and structural collapse was an ever-present threat, human beings had created something that functioned. Not well, not safely, not in any way that an engineer would approve, but it functioned. Coruscant, for all its impossibility, represents the same aspirations scaled to absurdity. 1 trillion beings, spread across 5,000 levels, somehow making it work, somehow finding community in the chaos, somehow building lives in a structure that shouldn't exist. The lower levels of Coruscant aren't just slums. They're proof that people will find a way to survive, to adapt, to create meaning even in the most hostile environments imaginable. The criminals of level 1313 aren't just criminals, they're pioneers, in their own twisted way. Colonists of the impossible dark. When we criticize Coruscant's engineering, we're missing the point. The point was never the engineering. The point was the people. 1 trillion stories, stacked on top of each other, pressing down toward a foundation that should have collapsed millennia ago, but somehow, impossibly, hasn't. That's not bad world building. That's mythology. So how is the bottom level not collapsing? The honest answer? It should be. The structural load exceeds known material limits by a factor of 128. The atmospheric pressure at depth would be unsurvivable. The accumulated heat would bake the lower levels into uninhabitability. The timeline places ancient structures at the modern surface, despite 100 millennia of upward construction. Nothing works. Nothing makes sense. Nothing survives the scrutiny of basic physics. And none of that matters. Coruscant was never meant to be calculated. It was meant to be dreamed. George Lucas, visual genius that he is, built a wonder without consulting the engineers, who would have told him it couldn't exist. He trusted that audiences would feel the scale without doing the math. He trusted that the image would overwhelm the impossibility. He was right. 25 years after the prequel trilogy first showed us the city planet in its full digital glory, Coruscant remains one of the most iconic science fiction settings ever created. Not despite its impossibility, because of it. The math may be damning, but the dream is beautiful. And in a galaxy far, far away, sometimes the dream is enough. The next time you watch the prequel trilogy, pay attention to the establishing shots of Coruscant. Watch the traffic streams weaving between endless towers. Watch the Senate building rising from the urban expanse. Watch the Jedi Temple sitting impossibly at the surface, its ancient spires somehow never buried by the construction that should have overwhelmed it millennia ago. And allow yourself, for just a moment, to stop calculating. The bottom level isn't collapsing because George Lucas said it doesn't collapse, because the story requires a city planet, and a city planet requires ignoring everything we know about structural engineering, atmospheric physics, and thermodynamics. Coruscant is impossible, and it's perfect. The physics are damning. The dream is beautiful. Sometimes, in science fiction, the dream wins. Subscribe for more stories like this.